All right, so we're diving deep today, folks, into the sometimes murky, sometimes exhilarating world of contract communication.
Ah, contracts.
Contracts, yeah. We all deal with them. And honestly, who hasn't had at least one near miss or a moment of, wait, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, those moments can be memorable.
To say the least.
Yeah.
But that's why we're here. We've got a ton of great material to dig into, tips, strategies, the whole 9 yards to help you navigate those high-stakes contract conversations and maybe even, inject a little humor into the process.
That little humor never hurts.
Never hurts, right? It can be a bit like a soap opera at times, with those dramatic pauses, the back and
Oh,
forth.
absolutely, the back and forth.
And let's not forget the potential for, shall we say, misinterpretations. I mean, I once heard a story about a deal that almost went south because someone mixed up bi-weekly and bi-monthly payments.
Oof, that's a classic.
A classic contract communication mishap.
Mhm.
But speaking of avoiding costly mistakes, we'll also unpack how one non-native English speaker used a single phrase, just one, to save $1 million deal. Pretty incredible.
Yeah, the power of language.
The power of clear communication, for sure. And to guide us through all this, we have our expert ready to break it all down.
Well, I'm excited to be here, ready to unpack all the essentials.
And honestly, one of the biggest things is just demystifying the language. Even for seasoned professionals, contract jargon can be a bit of a minefield.
Absolutely.
I mean, I once met a tech CEO who, I kid you not, thought force majeure meant some kind of fancy lunch break.
Golly. Oh, that's fantastic.
I know, right? So clearly, there's a need for some, let's call it contract lingo 101.
Definitely.
So let's start with the basics and maybe address some of those common phrases that often trip people up. Force majeure being one of them, apparently.
So force majeure, it's essentially a clause that deals with unforeseen circumstances, events beyond anyone's control that might disrupt a contract.
So not a lunch break.
No, not a lunch break. Think more along the lines of natural disasters, pandemics, major political upheavals, things that could genuinely prevent someone from fulfilling their contractual obligations.
Got it. So it's about allocating risk, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way to say, hey, if something truly crazy happens that's outside our control, this is how we're going to handle it.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how about the contract stipulates? It sounds so formal, so legalistic.
It does, doesn't it? But at its core, it's really quite simple. The contract stipulates just means the contract states or the contract says. It's a way to emphasize that what follows is a legally binding obligation.
So it's all about adding weight, basically.
In a way, yes. It's like saying, pay attention, this is important.
Makes sense. Now, another one that pops up all the time, hereinafter.
Ah, yes, hereinafter. Another one of those legal shortcuts. It essentially means from this point forward or from now on, but specifically within the context of the contract.
So it's a way to avoid repetition.
Exactly. Instead of saying party A, as defined in Section 1 every single time, you can just say hereinafter referred to as party A.
Saves everyone a lot of time and ink, I guess.
And potential confusion. The goal is to make the contract as clear and concise as possible.
Okay, so we're starting to decode some of this jargon, but how can we, actually make these terms less intimidating?
One practical tip I often recommend is to create a contract translation guide. As you encounter unfamiliar terms, jot them down alongside their plain English explanations.
It's kind of like a contract glossary.
Exactly. And you can add to it over time as you encounter new terms or different interpretations. I even had a client who used to stick these little notes with legal terms and their definitions all over his office, almost like a contract-themed wallpaper.
I love that. It's about making the language more accessible.
Exactly.
But it's not just about understanding these terms ourselves, right? We need to be able to explain them to others, especially if we're working with teams who might not be as familiar with contract lingo.
That's a crucial point. Being able to translate legalese into plain English is a valuable skill in any contract negotiation. It builds trust, avoids misunderstandings, and makes the whole process a lot smoother.
And it can even prevent some serious costly mistakes.
Yeah.
I remember hearing about a junior associate who literally saved her company $1 million just by clarifying the meaning of net 30. Turns out half the team had a completely different interpretation.
Wow, that's a powerful example of why clear communication is so important. And it highlights the importance of not being afraid to ask questions.
Right. Sometimes the simplest question can save you a ton of trouble down the line. Don't be afraid to say, hey, can we just break this down for a second, make sure we're all on the same page?
Exactly. Asking for clarification is never a sign of weakness. It's a sign of intelligence. And it's the first step towards creating clear, strong agreements that everyone can understand and confidently stand behind.
So we've tackled some key terms. But now, let's talk about the communication chaos that often surrounds contract drafts, especially in the digital age. I'm talking about those endless email chains with confusingly named files. Everyone's got their own version of really final.doc. And it's a nightmare trying to figure out what's what.
Oh, the version control nightmare. I've seen it countless times. And it can lead to some serious headaches.
Headaches, missed deadlines, and even potential legal disputes. It's like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. But the good news is that there are some simple strategies we can implement to streamline the process and avoid those pitfalls.
So what's the antidote to this version control chaos?
Well, one key element is to establish a clear and consistent contract communication blueprint. And a big part of that is a robust version control system.
Okay, so ditch the vague file names and get specific.
Exactly. Instead of those endless finals, use a clear and logical system that includes the date and a specific version number.
So something like Service Agreement 2024 March 15 V3.2, that's way clearer.
Much clearer, yes. And with each revision, no matter how small, bump up that version number. It creates a clear audit trail and eliminates confusion.
It's like having a time machine for your contract drafts.
Exactly. And it can save you a lot of time and frustration when you need to track back to specific changes.
Okay, so clear file names, check. What about the content of those emails themselves? I feel like they can get pretty convoluted too.
Oh, absolutely. That's why it's crucial to apply the same principles of clarity and conciseness to our email communication.
So no more rambling paragraphs and vague requests.
Exactly. A simple but effective rule of thumb is to always state what changed, why it changed, and what action you need from the recipient.
So something like updated payment terms in Section 3.2 from Net 30 to Net 45, as per finance's request. Please review and confirm by Thursday.
Perfect. Straightforward and to the point.
Okay, so we've got our file names sorted, our emails are streamlined. What else can we do to make sure those contract discussions, especially in our digital age, are as smooth and productive as possible?
Well, let's not forget about those virtual meetings. They've become a mainstay of modern business, but they also come with their own set of communication challenges.
Yeah, and I feel like those virtual contract discussions often have a way of spiraling out of control. What was supposed to be a quick review turns into a 2-hour debate.
It happens all the time, and it's often because people confuse reviewing with rewriting.
Right. It's like they see a virtual meeting as an open invitation to renegotiate the entire agreement.
Exactly. So how do we prevent those virtual discussions from turning into marathon sessions?
Yeah, any tips?
Here's a power move. Before any virtual contract meeting, send out a pre-meeting email outlining the specific sections you'll be discussing and the key decisions that need to be made.
So it's like setting an agenda and boundaries.
Precisely. It sets clear expectations and ensures that everyone comes prepared and focused on the task at hand.
It saves everyone a lot of time and frustration.
Absolutely. And here's another pro tip, and this is one I can't recommend enough. Set up a dedicated communication channel specifically for contract-related questions.
Okay, like a separate email thread or a shared document.
Exactly. It could even be a dedicated chat group if that works for your team.
So instead of those questions getting lost in the general email inbox chaos, they have a dedicated space.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it creates this easily accessible resource where anyone can go to find answers, clarify doubts, or even share relevant information.
I love that. It's like having a direct line to contract clarity. I worked with a tech startup in Singapore that implemented this, and they saw their contract signing time decrease from, get this, 3 weeks to just 5 days.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's amazing what a little bit of organized communication can do. So we've covered some key strategies for decoding contract lingo and streamlining our digital communication. But now let's venture into a realm where those communication skills become even more crucial. Let's talk about navigating the complexities of intercultural contract negotiations.
Ah, yes. This is where things get really interesting. Because now we're not just dealing with the nuances of language, but also the nuances of culture, customs, and communication styles.
Right. What might be considered perfectly direct and efficient in one culture could be perceived as, I don't know, aggressive or even disrespectful in another.
Absolutely. And those cultural misunderstandings can have a huge impact on the success of a negotiation.
The Silicon Valley startup I know almost lost a major deal with a Japanese corporation because their communication style was, well, a bit too Silicon Valley.
What do you mean?
Very direct, very focused on getting straight to the point, hammering out those terms. And it didn't go over well in that particular cultural context.
It's a classic example of how cultural sensitivity is not just a nice to have, it's essential for success in today's globalized business world.
Yeah, what works in New York might not work in Tokyo, and what flies in London might flop in Dubai.
Exactly. So we need to develop a whole new set of communication skills, almost like learning a new dance.
It's like contract conversation choreography, knowing when to lead, when to follow, and when to just pause and listen.
I like that analogy because it really is about finding that rhythm, that flow that works for everyone involved. And that flow can vary greatly depending on the cultures you're interacting with.
So how do we become more fluent in this intercultural conversation choreography?
Well, one key aspect is to be mindful of the different roles that silence and timing play in different cultures.
Okay, like how so?
Well, in some cultures, a pause might indicate careful consideration, a sign of respect for the other person's perspective.
Right, but in other cultures, that same pause might be interpreted as hesitation or even disagreement.
Exactly. And even the pace of a conversation can have different cultural implications.
So how do we navigate those subtle but important differences?
One technique I recommend is what I call the triple check approach. First, you state the contract point clearly in, let's say, standard business English. Then you provide a practical, real-world example to illustrate your point. And finally, you request feedback in a culturally appropriate manner.
So instead of just saying, "Do you agree?" you might say something like, "What are your thoughts on how this clause might be applied in your specific market?"
Exactly. It's about being mindful of those cultural nuances in how feedback is given and received.
And it's about adapting our communication style to create a more harmonious and productive negotiating environment.
Precisely. And I've seen this approach work wonders in cross-cultural negotiations. I remember working with a British executive who was initially struggling to close deals in Singapore.
What's happening?
Her communication style was very direct, very efficient, which worked well in London, but was perceived as a bit rushed and impersonal in the Singaporean context.
So how did she adjust?
She started incorporating what she called relationship investment time into her negotiation process. Instead of jumping straight into the contract terms, she'd spend time getting to know the other party, asking about their families, discussing their long-term goals, and building that personal connection.
Did it work?
It made a world of difference. Her contract completion rate in Singapore increased by 40% after she started incorporating those relationship-building strategies.
That's incredible. It really highlights how those seemingly small gestures can have a huge impact.
Okay, so we've talked about decoding lingo, mastering digital communication, and even factoring in cultural nuances. What else should we keep in mind as we navigate the world of contracts?
Well, let's talk about one of the biggest challenges in contract discussions. Those moments where everyone thinks they understand a term, but they're actually interpreting it in completely different ways.
Oh, those definition deadlocks can be so frustrating.
Absolutely. And they can derail an entire negotiation if they're not addressed effectively. Yeah, I remember working on a software licensing agreement, and we spent an hour debating the definition of system downtime. Turns out, we all had completely different ideas of what constituted downtime.
It's a classic example of how those seemingly straightforward words can become major sticking points if we don't clarify their meaning up front.
So how do we avoid those definition deadlocks?
One technique I found very effective is what I call the real-world reference method. Instead of getting bogged down in abstract definitions, try to ground the conversation in a practical scenario.
Okay, give me an example.
So going back to that system downtime scenario, instead of just defining it in abstract terms, you could say something like, okay, let's imagine a scenario where a user in Tokyo can't access the platform for 15 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. Would that be considered downtime under this definition?
That's a great way to make it concrete and relatable.
Exactly. And it forces everyone to think about how the definition would actually play out in a real-world situation.
And it can help uncover those hidden discrepancies in interpretation.
Absolutely. And speaking of uncovering discrepancies, I remember hearing a story about a junior associate who saved her company from a potentially costly misunderstanding just by asking a simple clarifying question.
Oh, I love those stories. Tell me more.
Well, she was in a contract review meeting, and she noticed the term regular maintenance kept popping up, but something about it felt off to her.
Like a sixth sense for ambiguity?
Maybe. So she did something really clever. She asked each stakeholder in the meetings what regular meant to them in that specific context.
Wow, what a smart approach.
Right. And what she found was a range of interpretations, from weekly to monthly to even quarterly.
Can you imagine the potential for chaos if they hadn't clarified that?
It could have been a disaster. And it's a great reminder that even those seemingly simple words can be landmines if we don't take the time to define them clearly.
And sometimes it takes a fresh perspective, like that junior associate, to spot those potential landmines.
Exactly. It's about empowering everyone, regardless of their experience level, to speak up and ask those clarifying questions. Now, are you ready to explore some specific power moves that can really elevate your contract communication?
Bring on the power moves.
All right, let's kick things off with a technique that can be particularly helpful for non-native English speakers, although it's a great strategy for anyone who wants to make sure they're really grasping those complex legal terms.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It's called echo and enhance.
Echo and enhance.
Yeah, pretty straightforward, actually.
Yeah.
Whenever you encounter a term you're not 100% sure about, you just repeat it back to the speaker, kind of like an echo, and then add a practical example to illustrate your understanding.
So it's like saying, okay, I think I get it, but let me just make sure we're on the same page here.
Exactly. It's a way to check your comprehension and also demonstrate that you're actively engaged.
And by providing that real-world example, you're not just passively listening. You're showing that you can connect the dots, apply the concept.
Precisely. And it helps to ground the conversation in something concrete, something everyone can relate to.
So, for instance, if someone throws out the term consequential damages, you might say,
Consequential damages, so like if our delayed delivery caused your factory to shut down, that kind of thing.
exactly. You're showing that you understand the concept, but you're also clarifying the specific implications.
And it opens up the conversation for further clarification if needed. It's a win-win.
It takes you from being a passive listener to an active participant. And it's especially helpful when you're dealing with those abstract legal concepts that can feel a bit, well, disconnected from reality.
Right. And speaking of making things concrete, let's revisit a strategy we touched on earlier, the clarity cascade.
Ah, yes, the cascade. Remind me how that one works.
It's a 3-step process for breaking down complex legal terms into, well, more digestible chunks.
Digestible chunks. I like that.
So, you start with the formal legal term as it appears in the contract. Then you provide a plain English equivalent. And finally, you top it off with a real-world example that everyone can understand.
So you're essentially acting as a translator and a storyteller, bringing those dense legal concepts down to earth.
Exactly. And it can be surprisingly effective, especially when you're working with people from different backgrounds or who might not be as familiar with legal jargon.
It's about making the language accessible to everyone at the table.
Precisely. I once worked with a legal team that used this technique to explain a complicated indemnification clause to a group of non-lawyers.
Okay, how did they do that?
Well, they started with the legal definition, then translated it into plain English, and finally, they used a simple analogy about a faulty toaster to illustrate how it would work in a real-world scenario.
The faulty toaster analogy, I love it. It's about finding those relatable examples that click with people.
Exactly. And sometimes it's the most unexpected examples that work best. All right, moving on to another power move that can really shift the dynamics of a negotiation.
Okay, lay it on me.
It's called the precision request, and it's all about challenging those vague terms that can cause a lot of headaches down the line.
You mean words like reasonable, best efforts, timely manner?
Exactly, those slippery little words that seem straightforward on the surface but can have wildly different interpretations.
Oh, tell me about it. I once spent an entire meeting debating the definition of reasonable efforts. It was like going down a rabbit hole.
And that's exactly what the precision request helps you avoid, those rabbit holes of ambiguity. It's about asking those clarifying questions up front, like, can we define what reasonable means in this specific context? Or what would constitute a timely manner in terms of deliverables?
It's about replacing those vague assumptions with clear, measurable standards. And it's something anyone can do, even if they're not a legal expert.
Exactly. It's about advocating for clarity. And speaking of clarity, let's talk about the bridge and build approach.
Bridge and build. Okay, I'm liking the sound of this already.
So imagine you're dealing with a particularly complex clause or concept, something that might make people's eyes glaze over. The bridge and build approach helps you break it down into more manageable pieces.
Manageable pieces, like bite-sized chunks of information.
Exactly. You start by building a bridge to common understanding, using an analogy or a simple explanation that everyone can grasp. Then, once you've established that foundation, you can gradually build upon it, introducing the more nuanced aspects of the clause.
So it's like creating a step-by-step guide to understanding, starting with the familiar and then gradually moving towards the more complex.
Precisely. And a great way to build that initial bridge is by using an analogy that resonates with everyone. For example, if you're trying to explain a complicated liability clause, you might start by comparing it to car insurance.
Car insurance, everyone gets car insurance.
Right. You can explain the basic concept, how it protects you in case of an accident, how there are different levels of coverage, and so on. And then you can gradually transition to explaining how the liability clause in the contract is similar, how it outlines the responsibilities and potential risks for each party.
So you're taking something complex and abstract, making it relatable and concrete.
Exactly. And that's key to effective communication, finding those common points of reference that everyone can understand.
And it makes the whole process less intimidating, more approachable.
Absolutely. Now, let me tell you about a technique that can be a real game changer for anyone who feels a bit intimidated by those high-stakes contract discussions.
Okay, I'm all ears.
It's called the Confidence Catalyst, and it was developed by a non-native English speaker who actually became one of the most sought-after negotiators in her company.
Wow, that's impressive. What was her secret?
Her secret weapon: clarity cards.
Clarity cards. Okay, I've never heard of those.
They're basically small cards, almost like flashcards, that she would prepare before any important contract discussion. But here's the twist. She wouldn't just write down the legal terms. She would pair each term with a thought-provoking question.
So, for example, if the card said termination clause, the question might be, under what specific circumstances could this contract be terminated?
Exactly. And by having those questions prepared in advance, she was able to guide the conversation, clarify her understanding, and really position herself as a knowledgeable and engaged participant.
And it's about taking control of the conversation, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just passively listening, you're actively shaping the discussion.
Precisely. And that can make all the difference in how you're perceived at the negotiating table.
I love how these power moves combine preparation with active participation. It's
Yeah.
about being proactive, not reactive.
Exactly. And that proactivity can really boost your confidence and help you navigate those tricky contract discussions with more ease and clarity.
Now, let's talk about one of my favorite strategies, the pyramid of clarity. I always visualize it as like this solid structure building up to a clear understanding.
Yes, the pyramid. It's a great analogy because just like a pyramid needs a strong foundation, so too does any successful contract negotiation.
So at the base of the pyramid, we have
Those fundamental non-negotiable terms, the bedrock of the agreement.
the essentials, things like the parties involved, the subject matter, the queue obligations.
Exactly. And as you move up the pyramid, you start adding those more technical details, the specific clauses and provisions.
And finally, at the very top,
Those nuanced aspects, the finer points that require more discussion and clarification.
so it's about establishing that shared understanding of the essentials before diving into the complexities.
Precisely. It prevents those situations where people are operating from different levels of comprehension.
Right. It's like trying to build a house without a foundation. It's just not going to work.
Exactly. The Pyramid of Clarity helps you lay that foundation brick by brick, ensuring that everyone's on the same page at every level of detail.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Decoding lingo, mastering digital communication, navigating cultural differences, and even building that pyramid of clarity.
And now let's shift our focus to a topic that's becoming increasingly relevant in today's globalized digital world. Let's talk about mastering the art of remote contract negotiation.
Ah, yes, the world of virtual handshakes and digital signatures. This is where those communication skills we've been discussing become even more crucial, right?
Yes, absolutely, because now we're not just dealing with language barriers and cultural differences, we're also dealing with the challenges of communicating through screens, across time zones, and with all those potential technical glitches.
Right. And I think those moments of potential awkwardness, the silences, the delays, become even more pronounced when you're interacting virtually.
It's true. It can feel a bit like navigating a minefield of miscommunication.
Yeah, like that time a negotiator I know was in the middle of a crucial discussion when her internet suddenly went out. Can you imagine?
Oh, no, that's everyone's worst nightmare.
Right. But instead of panicking, she smoothly transitioned to her mobile hotspot and with a chuckle said, well, this is exactly why we need a solid force majeure clause that covers technical disruptions. Wouldn't you agree?
That's brilliant. She turned a potentially embarrassing situation into a teaching moment.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of being prepared for those technical glitches because let's face it, in the virtual world, They're bound to happen.
They are, so how do we make sure those hiccups don't derail our entire negotiation?
Yeah. Any tips for navigating the wild world of virtual contract discussions?
Well, a legal team I know in Tokyo who found themselves managing negotiations across multiple time zones actually developed a framework they call the 3 pillars of remote contract success.
3 pillars. Okay, I like the sound of this already.
And it really boils down to preparation, documentation, and connection.
Preparation, documentation, connection. Got it. So walk me through these pillars.
The first pillar, technical resilience, is all about anticipating those potential tech glitches and having backup plans in place.
So make sure your internet connection is stable, have a backup plan if it goes down, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Do you have a mobile hotspot? A secondary internet connection? A landline as a last resort? And test your equipment beforehand. Don't wait until the middle of a crucial negotiation to realize your microphone isn't working.
Right, those tech checks are crucial.
The second pillar is documentation discipline. And this one's all about being meticulous and recording every decision, every agreement, every point of clarification in real time.
So no more scribbling notes on random pieces of paper.
Exactly. Utilize shared documents, meeting minutes, chat logs, all the tools at your disposal to create a clear and comprehensive record of the negotiation.
It's like creating a digital paper trail.
Precisely. Because in the virtual world, you don't have those in-person cues and nuances to rely on. Everything needs to be documented clearly and accurately to avoid misunderstandings and potential disputes later on.
Okay, so we've got our technical basis covered. Our documentation is in order. What about the third pillar?
The third pillar is connection consciousness. And this is where those soft skills, that human element, really come into play.
Right, because it's easy to get so caught up in the technical aspects of remote communication that we forget about the importance of building rapport, establishing trust.
Exactly. So how do we cultivate those connections in a virtual setting where we're missing those nonverbal cues, that sense of shared presence?
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure.
One strategy I've observed in successful negotiators is what I call the digital empathy approach.
Digital empathy. Okay, tell me more about that.
It's about being incredibly attuned to those subtle virtual cues, even though you're interacting through screens. Reading body language, noticing facial expressions, paying attention to tone of voice.
So even though you're not physically in the same room, you're still picking up on those subtle signals.
Exactly. And it's about being proactive in engaging with participants who might be less vocal, making sure everyone feels heard and included.
So if someone's been quiet for a while, you might say something like, "Hey, I noticed you haven't chimed in on this topic. I'd love to hear your perspective."
Exactly. It's about drawing people in and making them feel seen and heard, even in that virtual environment.
And I'm guessing this becomes even more important when you're dealing with cultural differences where those communication styles can vary so widely.
Absolutely essential. Because what might be considered appropriate in one culture could be misconstrued in another. And remember that remote rapport matrix we discussed earlier?
Yes, the matrix.
It can be a valuable tool for navigating those cultural differences, even in a virtual setting.
Right, it's about taking those extra steps to understand and acknowledge those cultural nuances.
And it can make all the difference in creating a more harmonious and productive negotiating environment.
Okay, so we've got our 3 pillars: technical resilience, documentation discipline, and connection consciousness.
Yeah.
What else can we do to enhance clarity and effectiveness in those virtual contract discussions?
Well, I want to share a toolkit that I absolutely love, the Virtual Clarity Toolkit. It's packed with practical strategies for navigating those virtual negotiations.
A toolkit? Okay, I'm always a fan of toolkits.
One of the key features is the use of digital annotations to create what are called heat maps of the contract.
Heat maps, like those weather maps that show areas of high and low pressure.
Exactly. But in this case, you're using color coding to visually highlight areas of agreement, disagreement, or points needing further discussion.
So green for good to go, yellow for needs clarification, red for potential sticking point.
Precisely. It's a fantastic way to visually track progress and quickly identify those areas where you need to focus your attention.
I love how visual this is. It's so much more engaging than just scrolling through pages of text.
And it's a great way to make sure everyone's literally on the same page, even if they're miles apart.
Right, it brings that sense of shared understanding to the virtual world.
In addition to those heat maps, the toolkit also emphasizes the use of collaborative document editing tools.
So everyone can see what's being added, deleted, or modified in real time, just like those shared documents we use every day.
Exactly. And to keep things organized, it also includes what's called a decision journal.
Decision journal. Okay, what's that?
It's a shared document or a running chat log where you document every key decision, every agreement, every point of clarification as it happens.
So it's like having a digital record keeper for your negotiation.
Exactly. It creates that transparent and auditable record of the entire process, which can be invaluable if any disputes arise later on.
That's a great way to avoid those he said, she said situations.
Absolutely. Now, this might surprise you, but some of the most successful remote negotiators actually embrace those inevitable technical glitches as opportunities.
Really? That's an interesting perspective. How do they do that?
One executive I know keeps what she calls a technical timeout template handy.
Technical timeout template.
Yeah, whenever there's a technical disruption, a dropped call, a frozen screen, whatever, she uses it to seamlessly transition into a brief, relevant anecdote or case study related to the contract.
So instead of that awkward silence, that scramble to reconnect, she uses those moments to reinforce key points, provide valuable context, keep the momentum going.
Precisely. And her team has also started incorporating reflection pauses into their virtual negotiation timelines.
Reflection pauses.
Yeah. Essentially, they build in short breaks, 5 to 10 minutes, where everyone steps away from their screens, processes information, gathers their thoughts.
It's like hitting the reset button.
Exactly. It can be incredibly helpful in those complex, multi-hour virtual negotiations that can drain your mental energy.
Right. It gives everyone a chance to recharge, come back refreshed and ready to engage.
Now let's talk about a visually engaging approach that can really enhance those virtual contract discussions, the Screen Share Symphony.
Screen Share Symphony. Okay, you've definitely got my attention with that one.
It's a technique developed by a legal team in London, and it's all about using screen sharing strategically to guide attention and enhance comprehension.
So they're essentially orchestrating the flow of information using visuals.
Exactly. And they do this by alternating between 3 different views.
3 views. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
The first view is the helicopter view. It shows the entire contract structure at a glance, providing that big picture perspective.
So everyone can see how all the pieces fit together.
Exactly. Then they zoom into the deep dive view, which focuses on specific clauses, their details, the nuances.
And finally,
The impact map view. This one visually illustrates how changes in one section of the contract might affect other parts.
so they're essentially taking everyone on a guided tour of the contract, zooming in and out, highlighting key connections, and making it a much more interactive and engaging experience.
Precisely. And that visual element can be incredibly powerful, especially in a virtual setting where it's easy for people to get lost in the details.
Right. It helps to keep everyone focused and engaged.
And it plays to the strengths of that virtual environment, using technology to enhance communication and clarity.
So we've got the helicopter view, the deep dive, and the impact map. What a symphony of visual communication.
And speaking of communication, let's talk about one final strategy for building rapport and connection in those remote contract discussions, the remote rapport matrix.
Ah, yes, the matrix. It's about being intentional in creating those moments of connection, even in the virtual world.
Exactly. And it starts with understanding the cultural backgrounds of the people you're negotiating with, taking the time to do a little research, learning about their customs, traditions, even their personal interests.
So it's about going beyond just the legal terms and acknowledging the human beings on the other side of the screen.
Precisely. And then intentionally incorporating those insights into the conversation.
So for example, if you're negotiating with a team in India during Diwali, you might start the meeting by acknowledging the festival and its significance.
Exactly. Or if you're working with a team in Brazil during Carnival, you might mention your love of Brazilian music or ask about their favorite samba schools.
It's about finding those points of connection, those shared interests that can help build rapport and create a more relaxed and productive atmosphere.
And it's about showing respect for other cultures, which can go a long way in building trust and fostering collaboration.
And ultimately, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Building strong, sustainable relationships based on mutual understanding and respect.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, contracts are about people.
And people do business with people they like and trust.
Exactly. So let's make those connections, build those bridges, and turn those contract discussions into opportunities to foster positive and productive relationships. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring all these different facets of contract communication.
It really has. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, for you, what does it all boil down to? What's that key takeaway?
You know, I think it's about recognizing that clarity isn't just about the words we use, it's about the approach we bring to the table.
Okay, I like that.
It's that genuine desire to understand and be understood, to create agreements that work practically for everyone.
So it's not just about, ticking the legal boxes. It's about building those relationships, that trust.
Exactly. And I think back to that European company we discussed, the one that really focused on those relationship milestones in their Asian negotiations.
Oh, yeah. What a great example of how those small gestures, those efforts to connect, can really pay off.
It shows that those human connections, they matter. Maybe now more than ever.
Absolutely, especially in today's world where business is so global, so fast-paced.
You have to be intentional about building those bridges.
And clear communication is the key.
It's the foundation.
It's about asking questions, admitting when you're not sure, making sure everyone's voice is heard.
And remembering that contracts, they don't have to be these adversarial things.
Right, it's not about winners and losers.
It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
So throughout this deep dive, we've explored a ton of techniques. I mean, we've talked about the echo and enhance, the pyramid of clarity.
The clarity cascade, all those virtual tools, those heat maps, the timeouts.
And the beauty is, these strategies, they can be adapted. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
You find what works for you, what resonates.
Exactly. And it's not about trying to sound like a lawyer, right?
No, not at all.
It's about being clear, being confident, being able to bridge that gap between legalese and, well, plain English.
And ultimately turning those contract discussions, which can feel a bit daunting, into something more positive.
Into opportunities.
Opportunities to collaborate, to build trust, to create agreements that benefit everyone.
So as we wrap up, I think the message is pretty clear. Clear communication, it's the foundation.
It's essential.
And with the right tools, the right mindset, anyone can master it.
Anyone.
So go forth, communicate with clarity, and make those contracts work for you.
Until next time, remember, confusion might be temporary, but clarity sticks around.
That's it for our deep dive into contract communication. We hope you found it valuable, and most importantly, we hope you can put these strategies to work.
Go out there and negotiate with confidence, with clarity, and with a genuine desire to create agreements that benefit everyone involved.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, happy negotiating.